Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all of you joining us for this fourth event in the GOVTRAN final conference series. My name is Tim Rayner, and I'm a research fellow at the University of East Anglia, affiliated to the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. And it's my pleasure to chair the Roundtable panel today. This series of events marks the end of the first three-year term of the Jean Monnet network GOVTRAN, which stands for the Governing the EU's Climate and Energy Transition in Turbulent Times. GOVTRAN is led by the Free University of Brussels in collaboration with Ghent University, the University of East Anglia, and the University of Eastern Finland. Under GOVTRAN auspices, we've published special issues and policy briefs. We've organised a MOOC and a series of events, including this final conference series. So if you haven't already, we would invite you to explore these on our webpage. The project has sought to examine EU climate and energy policy against the background of broader geopolitical and societal trends that threaten to destabilise progress in dealing with climate change, including, for example, the rise of populism, declining political legitimacy, and social cohesion. We've done so with a view to bridging academic and policy discussions. We've already held an excellent keynote event with Diederik Samsom of the DG Climate, or of the Cabinet in the Commission of Frans Timmermans, and also roundtables exploring trade and citizen participation related aspects, all available now as recordings. Today, we'll be examining an issue of increasing salience in EU climate policy, adaptation to climate impacts, which the Commission defines as policies and practices and projects which can moderate damage, improve resilience, and/or realise opportunities associated with the impacts of climate change at all levels of society. Our premise is that the decades ahead will be characterised by increased turbulence and transformational change in terms of physical climate impacts, but also potentially in terms of the policies and institutions developed to address them in the EU, as indeed anywhere. As expressed in its revamped Climate Adaptation Strategy from earlier this year and a related Horizon Europe mission, both of which we'll be hearing about shortly, the Commission now recognises the critical importance of transformation towards a climate resilient as well as a climate neutral EU. There are interesting signs that an effort is underway to engage citizens much more in this endeavour. Today we ask, what are the implications for EU policies, policy practices and institutions as currently configured? How might they need to underpin their legitimacy and navigate the demands of a more transformational future? What kinds of obstacles might need to be addressed? Before I introduce the speakers, a few housekeeping remarks. Firstly, the event is being recorded. Secondly, we'd encourage participants to post questions and comments using the Q&A function rather than the chat function. As far as possible, we'll try to take up these questions in the last 30 or 40 minutes or so of the meeting. But I will also have a couple of GOVTRAN related questions of my own that I will hope to put myself. And I'll try to prioritise questions that look particularly relevant from that GOVTRAN perspective. So with no further ado, onto our panel. We've got four excellent panelists, handpicked really to speak to various aspects of the scene that I just set in previous remarks. In order of appearance, they are Elena Vishnar-Malinovska, who's head of units in the adaptation unit at DG Klima of the European Commission. Thomas Kurtz, who at DG Research and Innovation is working on the mission on climate change adaptation, including societal transformation. Kirsten Dunlop, who I hope will be joining us shortly, is Chief Executive Officer at the European Institute of Innovation and Technology Climate Kick, or Knowledge and Innovation Community. And the fourth speaker will be Robert Beesbrook, Associate Professor at the Public Administration and Policy Group at Wageningen University, who very relevantly for our purposes is coordinating the Europe chapter of the forthcoming assessment report of the IPCC. So what we've done is ask each panelist to provide an opening presentation of up to 10 minutes on issues that pertain broadly to their own role in the ongoing effort to enhance Europe's ability to adapt to increasingly visible climate impacts. So let's start with our first speaker, Elena Vishna-Malinovska from DG Klima, who will give us an overview of the EU's recently updated climate strategy. Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim, and I'm really pleased to be here with you on this afternoon. Change and adaptation go hand in hand in the history of humanity. And as Stephen Hawking famously said in his Oxford University graduation speech, intelligence is the ability to adapt to change. But we are sure to expect more change, even if we manage to succeed in halting all greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, let alone being climate neutral by 2050, as goes the commitment of the European Union. Because even if we are neutral to the climate will not be neutral to us. And this is what we are already seeing unfolded in damages across the world. So our collective intelligence as a society will be measured by our ability to adapt to this unavoidable change. Few painful learnings. It is clear from the pandemic that insufficient preparation can be deadly. Against climate change impacts, there's no vaccine. Preparation can take a long way, and every single region in Europe is affected by climate change. But the direction of travel is here. The Paris Agreement sets a global goal on adaptation. And with the European Green Deal and the European climate law, we are translating that vision of climate resilience into our adaptation strategy. This strategy builds actually on successful track record of adaptation in Europe. We have been adapting in Europe, and we have slowly developed certain frameworks for tackling impacts. And it brings, of course, a renewed focus and covers new areas and priorities in the sort of whole of government, whole society approach. And this is the only way if we want to tackle such a horizontal challenge. Now, we want to make the adaptation smarter. It means we want to push the frontiers of science on adaptation to stimulate the European research base to the best way it can provide. So this will make, for example, possible for the European farmers to get access to the latest drought resistant crops, or ski resort operators to get the snow projections, or that communities can draw on the most effective governance models for adaptation. And you will hear from Kirsten about it. We will be putting also into public use more of the essentials for decision making. Data is essential about the economic past losses, but also we need the projections and precise modeling about future hazards. And this is again making it possible for you and me, if you buy your house, to know what is its past, what is its future. If I'm an SME and I start a new production facility, how can I climate proof the production and its future? Or how a city can guarantee safety of its residents before the extremes. And we, of course, are developing also our knowledge on health aspects of climate change with the new observatory that was launched. And this is really to be better prepared for the tropical diseases that are already making their way to Europe, or to be better anticipating the shifts in allergy seasons. What does it mean to make adaptation more systemic? So we want to foster more the local, individual, and just resilience. Tim, you mentioned at the beginning the citizen engagement. And indeed, we want for cities to develop the tailored advisory support to help these climate vulnerable communities to find the expertise to plan and the resources to implement adaptation action. We also want to pay much more attention to Social justice and distributive aspects of adaptation. This is very much now debated, as we're as resilient as the most vulnerable among us. And of course, this would need to protect Europe's workers from heat waves, or by helping them to reskill in climate-affected sectors, typically tourism or agriculture. A proper consideration needs to be given to macro-fiscal aspects of climate resilience, and it is long time overdue. We are starting conversations with member states on the disaster impacts on the sustainability of public finance. And this could allow us to design more climate-proof fiscal frameworks and to work on risk transfer mechanisms like insurance. Nature-based solutions should be rolled out as no-regret, multi-benefit answers to adaptation channel through protecting and restoring of wetlands, peatlands, coastal maritime ecosystem, developing larger urban spaces. We need to go into faster adaptation. This means really bridging the adaptation gap we see between the planning and implementation. Significant resources are already available in the European budget, but we are working also with the European Climate Bank or the Investment Bank to give the adaptation plan the necessary boost. You will hear much more about the innovation solution by Thomas, but just to say we are trying to develop as many solutions as possible for use by the public sector and by private sector. Enough talk about adaptation, we need to start doing it. We already issued a guidance about how to climate-proof infrastructure under the EU funding, but we also want to go further towards a sort of first EU forward-looking risk assessment, combining all the knowledge and the technological superiority where Europe really primes, and also, of course, collaborate with the standardization organizations for building or product standards. We need to intensify our collaboration within insurance sectors, and only last week the Commission issued a review of its insurance regulations, the so-called Solvency II, where all companies that are subject to these rules actually have to assess the materiality of the exposures to the climate-related risks. And if they are vulnerable, then they have to prepare the climate scenarios that need to be reflected also in the strategic business decisions. So we are trying to build this space not only with insurers, but also with users of insurance, national authorities, cities, developers, or infrastructure operators. And the taxonomy, as you know, the criteria for insurance is creating a new golden standard for the sectors. And of course, the better the insurance penetration in member states, the better incentivization also of adaptation efforts through reduced premiums or through innovations like parametric insurance or the insurance of nature-based solutions. Let me touch finally on international. We are leading the way to the COP. There is a lot of discussion about adaptation as a make or break for advancing on cutting the emissions. And so far our, let's say, engagement with international partners has been rather ad hoc and at times low-key. We know that through the climate impact, Europe will suffer effects on trade, on migration, and this makes it, in politics, it makes it a sort of a strategic self-interest issue. Europe will not come empty-handed. We will bring the climate adaptation plan with us to the COP to show that Europe is ready with its plan. And also the President of the Commission announced an increase in financing for adaptation for our most vulnerable partners. And of course, this is not just about teaching the others. Here, it's really learning from the others. There are countries who are much better advanced in the communication command and chain of early warning than Europe is, as we've seen during the floods this year. So let me conclude that the stark warnings are there from the scientific community. The visibility of impacts of climate change is there. The recovery from a pandemic needs to become the defining moment where we will bring all these resources into where they should be, into taking action on climate change, so that we actually do not prevent a good future, but we cement the current generation's legacy to protect the future ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor, for that very clear introduction and overview of the ongoing EU adaptation strategy and the form that it now takes since the relaunch of the strategy in February. I think we'll move straight on to our next speaker, Thomas Kurz from the DG Research and Innovation, who has been working in support of the mission on adaptation and societal transformation. And we've asked him to talk a little bit today about where that initiative has come from and its intended role and importance to the overall strategy, because it strikes me as an interesting new departure in the way that the EU has been handling the challenge of adaptation. So no further ado, I will hand over and pass the floor to Thomas Kurz.
Thank you very much for having invited me and giving the very good opportunity to present the mission in the context of what Elena just has introduced, the new EU adaptation strategy, and also following speakers, in particular also Kirsten from Climate Kick, who's been actually leading the pack in terms of experience on the ground in this context. So I'm very happy to be able to present on the missions here. So I'm presenting on the mission on adaptation, on climate change, including societal transformation. And in terms of its origin, it needs to be said that the idea of the missions came from lesson learned from the previous framework program on research and innovation. It was introduced then in the legislation for the Horizon Europe, and was agreed together with the European Parliament and member states to cover 5 different areas for this first work program, and the first time we experiment on the emissions, including the one on adaptation to climate change, and there's others. The idea of the missions in general is to sort of channel research and innovation funding from Horizon Europe towards societal goals that then are addressed in a very concrete or a very focused way to produce actually impacts, to use research and innovation and go beyond the research and innovation funding and use more broader European efforts to actually make a change on the ground within an important societal topic. For this matter, what has been produced or created was early on, about 2 years ago, a mission board, an expert group of 15 people, which was in our case led by the former commissioner Connie Hedegaard, Commissioner on Climate, and also previously Environment Minister in Denmark. These people have led the work and the guidance on sort of scoping a first idea of what this vision could look like, and then the European Commission, together with its services and with continued support of the mission board and others, has developed that further into an implementation plan, which has now been adopted internally and will soon, actually within a few days, be officially published through communication of the European Union. And then this marks then also the official launch of the missions. One of the key players we have consulted and been working with in preparation is also Climate Kick in more open consultations on this. And so much of what you see has been inspired by their work and experiences, as much as we have also consulted with regions, citizens, and of course in-house. Before I go further into the actual introduction of the mission, I also want to say that we have from the beginning on really made sure that we develop our mission in parallel and sort of under the umbrella of the EU strategy on adaptation, which was developed sort of alongside with a head start of some half a year. And so you will be not surprised to see that the mission itself is really addressing a number of key dimensions of the adaptation strategy, and I will show this now. So the key objective of the mission is really fitting there, the adaptation strategy. The adaptation strategy has the main goal to have a climate resilient Europe by 2050. Now, the mission's key objective is to support at least 100 European regions and communities in becoming climate resilient by 2030, and really work and sort of function as a lighthouse, as sort of accelerator to that movement, to that effort that we now have in front of us, and transforming societies and systems, and really a systemic approach to transformation of the European societies to 2050 becoming climate resilient. We have three main areas, or three sort of sub-objectives there. In the first place, we want to reach a broad base where we really inform citizens, we help the citizen communities and regions to better understand and prepare for and manage climate risks, so that they are better prepared to actually what's coming. They better understand, and then the next step is then here in the middle, to help and support 150 regions and communities in designing a vision and innovation pathways, and then helping them also to develop solutions and enabling conditions that actually gets them out of where they are in the vulnerability and more towards being resilient. So it's really about finding solutions, testing them, experimenting with them, and then those that actually work in different contexts being then last step is then to upscale them. And that is that we want to have 75 demonstrations where we have upscaled solutions that actually trigger systemic transformation and for climate resilience. So what this really engulfs is that the mission is really having a three broad dimension approach. One is it's place-based. We really want to work with the regions and communities on the ground to make this happen. It's a systemic approach where we really want to not only address single issues, but really, such as floods or forest fires, but really the whole aspect of a system, of a community, of a region that has to be, adopting or be climate resilient, and all the enabling conditions that come with it. And then to be inclusive, because societal transformation is actually only really be possible if you take the whole society with you. Now, this is not meant to be read entirely, but the whole point here of this thing is that the place-based nature of the mission is really that we want to support the regions to take them on whichever step of transformation they are, and to bring them forward and to help them to move forward to a societal transformation towards climate resilience. And that starts like in the bottom of the pyramid with better understanding and being better prepared, and moves then into the whole idea of thinking about possible futures and innovation pathways to get there, and to test and experiments with solutions that could be a solution. And then the blue bits, to really help them to upscale things, to create impact at scale, and to deliver cross-border value on these things. So it's about transformative change steps, and the mission is to support the regions and communities on this journey towards transformation towards climate resilience. The systemicness is maybe best captured here. So the idea is not to cover only one aspect, but really these a lot of aspects, and we have sort of thought about this as being best covered by these 10 areas of innovation and transformation, where you have a number of systems in the center, ecosystems and nature-based solutions, critical infrastructures, health being an element, water management, land use and food systems, all embedded in local economic systems, and being influenced by enabling conditions such as knowledge and data, governance and engagement, finances and resource, and very importantly, behavioral change, and the whole understanding of transitional sort of science or transformation science. The last aspect here of the approach is transforming together. So as I said before, it is key to all missions, but also in particular to this that has actually societal transformation in the title, that we work very closely with citizens and stakeholders on the ground to make this happen. So the mission here has has the intention to provide specific provisions and support to the regions and how to best engage citizens in all various steps of this transformational process, be it in co-creating a vision, a common vision of what climate resilience means for that regional community, in testing certain solutions, for example, or in actually being involved in further and large-scale deployment of them. So it's a very interesting perspective of this. At the same time, it also functions as a test case or as a testing ground or in a living lab of actually studying all these processes, on these various elements. There's 3 phases foreseen, so we cover 10 years really within the framework of the Horizon Europe. So starting, which is 7 years, but then projects go on longer. We have a build-up phase from 21 to 23. The first calls, and the Horizon Europe funding is still the key engine of this mission. The first real call on this will come out in the beginning of the year, from January to March. It will be open. It will cover some 120 million worth projects to kickstart the mission's main basic structure. Then there is a full deployment phase from 24-27 and a consolidation phase later on. Until the last 3 years, where we really want to bring home all the things we have learned from and sort of try to use that to push the efforts along the lines of the ambition of the EU strategy, namely to have all Europe being climate resilient by 2050. And with that, thank you very much, and I'm very open for any further questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for that very good introduction to the nature of the mission. I had a kind of point of clarification, I think, from what you said. Did you refer to the imminent launch of the implementation plan, I think you said, and could you describe what that will involve, the implementation plan as such?
Yeah, well, so basically what will be launched is the missions, all 5 missions together. And so the European Union has these communications, the EU communications from the European Commission that announces its activities or what it's doing. So there will be one very soon in the next days to launch the missions in general. So there will be a 15-page document explaining what the missions are in general, and then having a short description of each of the 5 missions. And then together with that, there will be also publicly accessible the implementation plans that have been developed to circumscribe, provide a framework on how the Commission intends to implement these missions over the coming years of the multi-annual framework. And so that is, I think, usually across all the mission, some document around 50 pages that basically explains, still in a fairly general and abstract way, of what are the key elements and how, by what nature do we want to mean or to implement these missions, and what are the key aspects of implementation, and what are the key ambitions, and obviously the key targets and objectives. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm very pleased to say that we've now been joined after a slight technical hitch initially, but we've been joined by Kirsten Dunlop, the CEO of EIT Climate Kick, as I outlined at the beginning, who we've asked to reflect a little bit on her experience and that of her organisation in processes on the ground, as it were, in a European context that are engaged in the kind of work that the mission encourages more widely, just to reflect on that experience of what it might take to have a more transformative approach to adaptation, perhaps, and what it requires from EU policies and institutions in terms of the support that would be conducive to those transformations. So, Kirsten, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim. And hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to join this conversation, also coming at such a wonderful, timely, long-awaited moment with the launch of the missions. Perhaps I think it might help if I also use some slides to just support a little bit a tangible sense of what's happening. Can you just confirm that you can see the big slide on resilient regions?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so just a very, for those of you who don't know the organisation that I am speaking on behalf of, I'm the Chief Executive of EIT Climate Kick, which is one of the knowledge innovation communities created at the end of 2009 by the European Commission. Our focus is on climate innovation, specifically on decarbonisation and adaptation, and we worked on adaptation and resilience from the outset of Climate Kick. We have always been working on the core sort of program theory of the EIT, which is around bringing together entrepreneurship, innovation development through universities, tech transfer, industry R&D, and capacity and capability building and mindset shifts. And really what we were reflecting on as we were looking forward into the next decade, when we came up with a theory of change for our work looking forward through 2017 and 18, was really very much almost a call to action, anticipating and looking at some of the reviews of Horizon 2020 and thinking about what does an organisation at the heart of Europe's commitment to climate action and climate innovation, capacity and capability building in innovation, what should we be focusing on? And we chose to focus on systemic change and systems transitions, really looking firmly at the kind of body of scientific evidence coming more and more through the IPCC process, but through other processes, where the call for the gap between policy commitments and a growing awareness of acknowledgement of a state of emergency, and the multiple solutions that are there and that are seeking to attract capital in the markets, this huge implementation gap in the middle, where the problem is systemic change requires orchestration. Multiple solutions need to join up, they need to join forces, be connected with policy, feedback loops need to be created. Change is behavioural and social when we're talking about climate more than anything else, and that requires consistent work in awareness raising, in realisation, but also in real participation, not just consultation, but active co-determination. So that's why we ended up at the beginning of 2019 launching something which was really like a do tank. Can we take a lot of the theory about the need for systemic change, for systems transformations, the possibilities and kind of the working prototypes of changing the way we do innovation to make that possible, and put it on the ground and try to make it work? And one of the areas that we have focused on from the outset is this question of resilience in adaptation, because we see it as being not only the context in which climate change becomes very, very real, and that therefore a huge catalytic context for mobilizing action, but very much the other end of a polarity, a completely interdependent polarity around decarbonization. Many of the solutions in resiliency and adaptation are effectively mitigation solutions, and many of the mitigation solutions need to anticipate design for a world in which climate is different and food systems are different and social cohesion and political cohesion is different. So really trying to work on this as one connected problem. what we sought to do is try and bring to life demonstrations, kind of a demonstration environment large enough to get beyond the kind of the seeing is believing mental problems of failure of imagination problem of what does it look like to take an entire region, an entire agricultural basin or entire city to an effective resiliency approach, kind of trying to lift the living lab concept up to the kind of scale that climate change really needs and urgently. And obviously, I mean, that was a few years ago. Now the sense of urgency from my perspective is even greater. So we really tried to introduce a methodology on the ground in partnership with what we define as challenge owners, so city governments, regional governments, national governments, often actually working national to subnational, and in some cases pan-European coalitions, and also the value chains, kind of global or regional value chains whose industries and businesses are very tightly connected into this, and shift the emphasis away from, or kind of moving towards much more integrated portfolio approaches, systems mapping, rapid learning cycles, sense making. So effectively what we do is introduce a methodology, this is what Thomas was referring to, where we work through an iterative process that is designing and deploying innovation for fundamentally an accelerated learning mechanism. This is not learning as a sort of a hypothetical, theoretical, come up with some ideas and then write a white paper. This is learning by doing on the ground, in streets, in communities, in farms, directly on rooftops, in wastewater treatment, in the way in which we're thinking about seed and cultivation and satellite information. It's really deployed on the ground in real places, in specific places. It very much is about agreeing, first of all, not so much objectives, but an intent, something large enough, representative enough, politically sort of viable enough to hold a complex change process, such as the mission, over time, and to hold it through different political processes and to hold it through different multi-stakeholder processes. Secondly, to really introduce a component of systems thinking in the very core of what is being designed and deployed, so that we think about sensitive intervention points or acupuncture points that might function or act as attractors to change the behavior and the economics of systems. We think about leverage points. We look at the relationship between what technologies are there or what social or fiscal possibilities are there, but how do they actually relate to existing policy and planning and so on. We introduce a very active learning process, an active dynamic, what we call the management of the portfolio. So this is about choosing solutions, putting in multiple solutions simultaneously that are inherently diverse, each of them clustering in around different positions related to levers for change or acupuncture points, really looking at combining and looking at what are the combinations between something that introduces a technology but requires a behavioral shift, is linked up to something fiscal, is perhaps connecting with an engagement or an educational piece, or indeed insurance or financing mechanisms that are not normally deployed. So how do we get a portfolio approach, a real place-based, real economy portfolio where we're testing a spread of possibilities and looking for the relationships and maximizing the relationships between different pieces of the puzzle. So if we just go back there. And one of the elements here that matters enormously is really closing the loop in terms of sense making. No, this doesn't want to go back. So this is very, very much about making sure that we don't just develop or award funding to innovations and let them be, but really actively work to understand what from this exercise, and here I'm particularly thinking forward to the missions, becomes useful for decision-making at scale, whether that's subnational decision-making between cities and regional areas, or agricultural value chains, or national or pan-European, because connecting innovation as a service, as a mechanism for understanding how to affect change at scale, it doesn't work unless we really bring it directly into decision-making, rapid decision-making and learning loops. Now, we have a number of practical examples. I'll talk just briefly about them because I think that might be one of the ways of contributing to this discussion in terms of what does this look like on the ground. We are working not only in terms of deep demonstrations in European contexts, but also leveraging Europe's satellite information, climate risk marketplace and a lot of the work that is being developed there in climate services, but also then connecting up, as Eleanor said, to the taxonomy and to shifts and new legitimizing frameworks for financial change and financial regulation, and looking at how do we connect that in terms of Europe's offering into Africa to strengthen resilience and connected supply chains across the Mediterranean. But specifically in terms of regions that we have worked with to kind of push this forward or really create a kind of a lighthouse environment, 4 of them in particular stand out. I'm going to really speak to Glasgow just as an example, since we're just ahead of COP. And indeed, actually what's happening in Glasgow, they've now published their adaptation strategy, is very much in line with what the missions are calling for and very much in line for what much of the COP agenda is really seeking to try and achieve. There are a number of other regions now following through, some of them much, much smaller, some of them connected, some of them beginning to look at synergies and relationships also in terms of geophysical similarities or economic similarities, or the possibility of cross-pollination. So there's kind of more beginning to gather momentum around the experience so far. And a lot of this work is sort of held and supported by a set of gathering expertise and momentum around some of the aspects that we know systems transformation in resiliency and adaptation struggles most with. How do we think about this from the perspective of complex human change, the Red Cross, Red Crescent's experience in what it means to support human kind of behavioral change and awareness shifts around the need, the sense of possibility and hope, the solutions, changes around political economy mapping, power and governance structures with E3G, or the notion of the Centre for Systems Solutions in terms of thinking about complex risk analysis, which is absolutely essential if you're then going to engage some of the financial system around resilience and get beyond the more sort of boxed in thinking around transition risk to really larger dynamic risks and dynamic financing for change. We've learned a number of things, and I'll finish with a couple of some reflections on what we've learned. It's absolutely essential to work this through a process of engaging the left-hand side of our brains as much as the right, to really bring in visualization and mapping as part of the way in which we engage directly on the ground, because we're talking here about the identity of place. And with the identity of place, the identity of people, how aware they are of where, in some ways, the rubber meets the road. What is climate going to mean really for them? And what will it mean to design for a very different kind of world? In the case of Glasgow, just to give you a specific example here, we chose with the city in the region to go in and not go in. There has been a lot of work done on flooding in Glasgow, and we chose deliberately not to go in there, but to try something that was more inherently systemic and see if we could get a kind of a different way of thinking about a portfolio that was more comprehensive. So we went in and started working on heat, health and well-being all together, and then layered in finance around that. And then we started to develop through a series of workshops we used bespoke sort of social network analysis to really start to build up a picture of stakeholders, build up a picture of the systems at stake, the intervention points, the possible positions. We started to really build around then the kind of the portfolio of where and how would we need innovation to help us understand how to tackle something as complex as adaptation and resiliency at the scale of the whole region, and do so in such a way that we bring relevant engagements in for everyone. So we use this process to highlight very strong connections between many of the substantive questions like housing, building stock, current and future, or land use, nature-based solutions, air quality, agriculture, but also cultural connections, community empowerment, infrastructure. So genuinely starting to create a frame that sounds incredibly complex, but was actually very intuitively recognizable and navigable for people who live there, because those are the elements of life, and bring them into a sense of this becomes a framework, like if you like a canvas for interventions in an adaptation strategy that are therefore much more inherently transformative and pushing for a much more transformative agenda. And that means that we've now got to the point where every individual intervention has a positive economic case. We can show the sort of net economic benefits, but we can also really show the pull through and the need for a shift, structural shift in finance. And that's why I'm just going to finish on a couple of slides that really pull out what are some of our key learnings from doing this work. We can see that there really is grassroots, real-world appetite for systemic approaches. I often live in a dichotomy between being told or hearing that systemic change, interesting theoretically, but in practice just way too complex for anyone to understand. That's not been our experience. People get systems if they're involved in a process in which they are literally mapping the things that are part of life and the things that are part of the environment, internally, externally, and in connected ways. It's very critical to create kind of boundary conditions that enable agility. So really looking to set markers for how and what you're working with, use visual examples, metaphors to introduce what it means to engage in systems change, the fact that systems can change themselves, just as human kind of communities, streets and neighborhoods adjust their behaviors and adapt. We've all experienced it with COVID. So there are kind of very vivid experiences and examples to talk to. And really the construct of a mission really works. The sort of notion of unlocking a leap of a faith, a leap of imagination, and a stretch goal, the sense of pulling towards something for which we don't have solutions, and creating that stretch out off the edge of where our sense of incremental kind of substitution or adaptation solutions sit. We've really learned how important it is to collaborate. Eleanor was talking about that, so was Thomas. It's absolutely essential that this is a thing that is done with, by, through, and it cannot be done in tokenistic and consultative ways. This is very much co-owning, co-designing, and understanding the power of identity and the power of cultural, of meaning. We cannot adapt and build resiliency if we don't start from constructs of meaning and identity. And then making sure that we think in much more nuanced and sort of sophisticated terms about transformation, about adaptation, understanding that this is not about a kind of a plug and play solution. This is very much about understanding the nature of life, the fabric of the way in which people are living. When I look forward to the launch of the missions and what possibilities now open with a fully pan-European legitimizing framework and kind of call for action for really scaling this kind of work out and scaling out the organizations like Climate Kick that are really trying to work together with challenge owners and regions and cities and governments and value chains. There are some really critical things I think we need to keep in mind. We are handling here something which is a mirror of climate change itself. We're trying to put our hands into complex, non-linear, complex adaptive systems. It means change doesn't happen in straight lines. It doesn't wait for us to solve it. We need to embrace the idea of complexity as a feature, not as a bug, and really kind of work with what we understand about that and deploy every skill set, every experience, and every appropriate tool for doing so. That really means we need to use the construct and the platform of the missions to get past the idea of single projects, predefined solutions, kind of bankable assets, deliverables in quick wins, because it simply does not help us do this kind of work. So this is really an opportunity for us to be bold and to step really firmly into a space of deployment of innovation as a form of experiential, extended, accelerated learning about the multiple incomplete pieces of puzzles that can come together and can be combined into much more effective solutions. And they require to be done so on the ground directly with people and bringing everybody through that process. And we've seen over and over that really begins to take. That's what's at the core of the Glasgow mission, as just one of a number of examples. But it does require a capability to hold it, the political will to accept its messiness, and the kind of legitimizing vision of the leap of imagination that says we can do this, and this is about hope and opportunity and renewal. It's not about loss and fear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirsten, for that very inspiring delivery there. We'll take a lot from that. I did say that I would sort of take points of information at this point mainly, but I'm kind of prompted, I think, just to reflect before Robert Beesbrook comes in and presents his 10 minutes. to understand, because it's a very inspiring, locally generated, co-produced development of solutions potentially over the next 10 years. And you talk about the recognition of complexity and such like. The question I have for you and the previous speakers as well would be, I mean, how does that fit in the vision of the missions, allowing these great labs to develop in the context of wider EU policy frameworks? Because we sometimes hear that they are rather more kind of statically conceived, they protect certain sites and what have you. Is it a possibility that solutions will be developed that don't quite fit the wider regulatory and policy framework in the EU, or is that something that the mainstreaming of the instruments that the adaptation strategy is also pursuing at the same time? Is that something that is taken care of by the wider mainstreaming agenda of the instruments? I'm just kind of struck by that willingness to let local solutions develop, and whether the wider policy framework is conducive to that. Maybe you could just offer a little bit of reflection on that before I move on to let Robert have his.
Elena, you gonna start?
Yeah, I can. Thanks a lot. It's always pleasure to listen to all of you. Well, first of all, as was mentioned, the approach that Climate Kick is already pioneering serve as a sort of inspiration also for the mission, because you cannot expect the local solutions that are being created to be transferred somewhere else, and this is where I really see always the benefit of the European space and of the Commission, I must say, because this is where we can act as a sort of interconnector, and bringing those, stimulating those in other parts of Europe. And sometimes there is this established thinking that this happens mostly where you have the institutes or the academia anchored. Not always. Sometimes you just need strong institutions like local authorities, and for adaptation this is extremely important. The educational, behavioral, and institutional strength. So I would say this is exactly what we want to do, but we will not. You can't wait. You can't also wait that this will be mainstream by itself. There are many players. There is a sort of sequence that needs to happen seamlessly, so that at the end you have the demonstration, you have the citizens on board, the sort of policy framework is conducive. There are no barriers, because sometimes even in our legislation, be it protective legislation on environmental protection, you can find some of these barriers. So it requires a lot of effort, from all these different levels that will have to be aligned. And this is where we often, I'm a friend of multi-level governance. It always needs to happen, but there are always some, sort of the chain of command doesn't pass through. So I would say very active effort will be necessary in this sort of joined up thinking and joined up working.
How about others? Would you like to just briefly address that point?
Yeah, maybe very briefly. I mean, first of all, I think Elena has really made the right points there in general. And maybe just to add there, I think one of the elements there is that the mission really tries to also, on the ground, to help with its work, to help the regions to make meaningfully sense of all the other opportunities and policies which are there, which are often, come across as being a bit static and stuff. But on the end, I mean, there is potential, a lot of potential, which at the moment is not used, to actually bring this together in a more coherent way on the ground. So the idea of a little bit of the mission was to actually give them a little bit the critical mass to work with on the, within specific regions, to bring all this together in some meaningful way. Now, having said that, there will be then also discoveries or insights on where there are barriers or where there are limits. And then it's been part of the learning experience, which also sort of Kirsten referred to in general, that the mission wants to learn and bring this up, channel this up all the way back to whatever level is necessary on decision making, including all the way up to the European Commission, and that we then have the commitment from within the Commission to work it out with our colleagues in respective services to work to undo these barriers in the best way, or to provide incentives where we have learned that they would be very beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you want to add anything, Kirsten, or shall I?
Look, I think I would really echo that. That's in so many ways that's actually the opportunity that the missions offer. I mean, in terms of the work that we do, there are 4 really significant structural barriers to working more systemically. One is the way in which we have designed the way we make resources flow, the way we make funding flows. We all, but public and private, this is a common kind of philanthropic funding, public granting, even kind of private finance investment, is all looking for individual projects. And it's all looking for kind of discrete deliverables against which you can prove kind of impact, outcomes, success, and so on. So it's running structurally counter to the idea of really connecting up multiple things and not assuming that anyone is a winning solution. So that's one thing that needs solving. Then there's a question around governance and kind of collaboration. We don't have governance structure to support radical collaboration, the kind of polycentric governance models that Eleanor Ostrom was referring to. We desperately need, especially in this space where you're dealing with commons, ultimately with governance of the commons. But again, there are experiments, there are tools, there's framework, there's thinking. We desperately need shifts in capability, the capability at all levels, in civil administration, on the ground, in farming communities, in business. That's probably one of the absolutely critical kind of issues. And we need impact frameworks. We don't, we have, again, there's a lot of us working on kind of nascent frameworks for how you ask a question that says, is this systemic effort working? But we need the training data. We need to build the training data with a sustained program of 3 or 4 years to start to say, look, we're starting to learn how to ask the question, how to observe the shifts, how to take on the learning from natural systems on ontological shifts, because that's really what we're talking about, kind of social ontological shifts. So I think the mission actually provides a framework that says, go for your life, kind of have a go at playing with some of these structural elements, because the idea is the feedback loop connects it straight up to policymaking so that we can start to serve in fast. We can see straight away there are 3 or 4 types of effective adaptation technology that simply won't scale because the regulation will not let them. So, that's a fast feedback loop. Does the regulatory change take longer? Maybe yes. But the more we've got this happening and a framework for it doing so, the more chance we have of closing those loops.
Okay, no, thank you for those responses. That's very interesting. And now I've kept our 4th speaker waiting a little bit longer than I anticipated. So we've invited Robert Beesbrook to provide more of an academic perspective of a scholar who's been looking at the history of adaptation policy, particularly in the European context, for a long and impressive track record, a period of time. So we've asked Robert to reflect on the evolution of the EU's adaptation policy over time and offer some reflections on the new strategy published in February and where it leaves us in terms of rising to the challenges that decades ahead will be presenting the European Union and other actors. So, Robert, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for inviting me for this talk. Thanks also for giving me the opportunity to reflect on some of the excellent presentations that that were already given. I've taken it upon me to be a little bit more critical, looking at the European Commission's efforts and looking at the progress that has been made in the last decades or even longer, and just give my personal reflections of what I feel are some of the key challenges and some of the things that we might be able to do in order to move forward. I'll try to keep it short because I think my point is relatively straightforward. So just to kind of summarize, and this has been addressed by some of the previous speakers, the Commission has already worked on climate change adaptation for a relatively long time, starting in 2005, recognizing that adaptation was needed, doing a public consultation in 2007, trying to understand what some of those elements are, formulating a white paper of how such a framework could potentially look like, and coming up with a strategy in 2013, which raises a number of issues that are also reflected in the current strategy. And so we need to build our knowledge base, we need to mainstream, we need to give access to some of these examples of successful adaptation actions. We need to provide data. We need to stimulate governments to engage in climate change adaptation through planning and implementation. And we need to engage the civil society in these actions. And between 2013 and the current strategy, a lot of stuff happened. A lot of these platforms have been implemented. The 2018 strategy, clearly, the evaluation of the strategy in 2018 clearly showed that a lot of progress has been made in trying to realize some of those ambitions, but there are still a lot of gaps. And I think the new strategy is trying to tackle some of those criticisms that were received in that evaluation process. I'm not going to repeat what was in the document. I think that was nicely done by previous speakers. So the question then is, how does this reflected at member state level and perhaps even at city or other community levels? And clearly, the member states, cities have started to adapt much earlier than the EU activities. But it's clear that the European activities that have increased since 2013 have also resulted in an increase in, at least in policy planning, and trying to develop some kind of frameworks, trying to raise awareness of what is actually needed to address some of those key risks. But as some of the previous speakers noted, there is this significant implementation gap that prevents us from really adapting to some of the key risks that we are facing in the future. So just to give an example, on the right-hand side, you see the figure of sea level rise and some of the policy activities and planning, the different scenarios used, etc., in order to plan for sea level rise. And you see a large inconsistency between the different member states of what they are actually doing in terms of planning for adaptation, investing in adaptation to deal with sea level rise. And this raises all sorts of questions about, is progress across the different member states actually sufficient? Is it addressing the problems in an equal manner? Are there some regions that are being left behind? And is the current effort at the European level and the coordination between the different member states sufficient to avoid risk displacement in the future when some of these risks become more manifest? And some of these risks are not just limited by kind of the internal coordination between the different member states, but also between Europe and the other borders. Yeah? In business and value chains, issues around migration, security, insecurity. So tackling these questions, I mean, they've been mentioned in the most recent strategy, but really getting a feel for how these are being tackled is not really made very explicit in the framework yet. So the question that I've asked myself when reading through the new strategy is the progress that we see at EU level and the progress at member state level enough? Because the stakes are relatively high. We know these impacts will accelerate. We know that these will go on even if we cut mitigation drastically. So is this idea of mainstreaming and creating this enabling environment where we, as Kirsten mentioned, where we bring people together, where we try to remove some of the barriers to inspire people to start adapting, is that still sufficient? Are the tools that are available to us still sufficient to address and accelerate this transformational action that is needed? Are our ambitions on adaptation sufficiently explicit and quantified? Or have we tried to tuck adaptation away in a more of a technocratic, administrative, mainstreaming type of process and remove what I think is the core element of the issue that explains why progress on adaptation over the last 10, 15 years has been relatively slow. And that's the idea that there is this consensus frame being built around adaptation. And if you read the new strategy, I think there will be hardly anyone disagreeing with its content. And these are all ambitious and highly relevant statements. But ultimately, adaptation is a political exercise. A lot of the constraints that have been identified by previous speakers have a deep political root cause of why progress is limited. And a lot of these adaptation actions inevitably lead to spatial, temporal, sectoral, societal conflicts, but these conflicts have not been really visible yet. So one of the ways in which we can move forward, perhaps, and I think this is something that we can have a little bit of discussion about, is to bring back this political dimension. For example, by trying to quantify some stuff. And one of the key issues around adaptation is that we have these sweeping statements that we want to be climate resilient by 2050 and we want to enhance adaptive capacity. But what does it actually mean? How do we know we get there? How can we create transparency and accountability mechanisms to hold governments and businesses accountable for the actions that they are taking or not taking? And perhaps this is also, I remember that from the 2013 strategy, there was a reflection or the possibility to consider stronger EU legal and institutional instruments to enforce or be a bit more stronger in the kind of EU actions on adaptation. But when you compare the 2013 and 2021 strategy, it's a similar kind of tools that are being used. The ambitions have been raised. The framing has been much more urgent, but the tools, underlying tools, are of a similar type. I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that very thought-provoking intervention there, Robert. And you mentioned how it might potentially be the basis of some to and fro between some of the speakers here today. So we're in the kind of question and answer phase, I guess, of the event today. I've noticed one question in the Q&A, which I will come to in a minute, but maybe maybe some of the previous speakers would like to address some of the points raised by Robert. Is it fair that up until today, progress has been somewhat incremental, and that maybe to be more transformative in future, it needs to kind of recognize that the political nature of some of the potential conflicts? Where does that leave us? Does it require something more of a concrete legislative response, as I think one of Robert's slides alluded to, where to become more transformative than it has been to date? Is there anything more that could be offered from the EU policy framework, or is the is it a little unfair to say that progress has been slow and is not on course to bring about some of the changes that we see as necessary? I wonder if you'd like to respond to Robert's points.
Thank you very much. I think it all depends how you look at it. I would argue that in question of speed, we are very slow also in cutting the emissions, and yet the urgency is absolutely there. Concerning the sort of more transformative, I think we've tried really to go there by looking, in the system and going not only to the national level as before, because we took before, the member states as the main implementer of adaptation. And I can tell you, this is where sometimes some countries are putting, a subsidiarity card very strongly before us, but we are now going really down almost to the sort of individual citizen-driven adaptations through, for instance, the Climate Pact, where we believe that, the impacts are so close to you that you start shifting in your mind, in your values, when you understand what it does require. Now, for the new policy, we do realize that a lot of leverage points, as Kirsten calls them, are outside, for instance, the environmental classical policy. If we want to make the financial system to react to the physical shocks in the world, we need to make sure that they do understand, how to manage risks. And I think there the industry of insurance is relatively well placed to do it. But it doesn't stop with insurance. It goes to the banks, it goes to the public budgets, etc. And here, yes, the tools are maybe similar, because planning is a sort of ancient art, isn't it? We all did planning, we all do planning. But it's a tool that you have to use. The climate risk assessments, I mean, it's a typical sequential, logical activity that you have to do, so that you see whether you will not suffer some sort of material damage based on the most difficult scenario you can imagine. So again, of course, this may be the same tool, but exactly what has been said before. There is a recognition that we cannot anymore work, just the food system, the energy system, the transport system, but you need to have a much more of the cross system view. The tools are being sophisticated. We don't have anymore the sort of static only reporting by member states, but we will be using much more the power of big data, of real live satellite observation data that is then being combined with projections, etc. So I think we are making, of course, some way to a different policy making. Now, when you say it's a political choice, yes, it is. We know very well you have three options to address climate change: is mitigation, is adaptation, is suffering. Nobody wants to suffer. But now the realization that you have a very limited, financial resources, and you want to shift as many as them on cutting the emissions, it led to the choice of delaying, adaptation. And as I said, preparation requires a long way. Also typically for countries that are affected by sea level rise, the Netherlands is already for decades, working on its program, or Copenhagen after the cloudburst of 2011 is, preparing for a decadal adjustment of the coast. So these are the mismatches that just do not, match with the policy cycles and with the financial cycles. But I do hope that with the new strategy and the mission, as the sort of accelerator of solutions, we will see a different kind of responses to impacts in the future.
Anyone else like to offer a response to Robert?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Again, support what Elena quite nicely present. She is really the master of the strategy, as she was in charge of developing it and bringing it about. So I think Robert is quite right to say that the adaptation is political. That not only will climate impacts bring about tensions on how they are distributed, which is often hitting more the ones that are already more vulnerable and impacted in society, but also will the transformation to climate resilience will shift some of that. And it is inherently political in the sense that there will be tension, trade-offs, things that really need to be addressed. Now, I think this is to some extent really also centrally addressed in the climate adaptation, which makes reference to the need for a just climate transition and a fair transition towards climate resilience. And it's also, I think, a fundamental part of the mission's approach, where we really want to engage everybody on the ground. That engagement or that governance structure that Kirsten wanted to also sort of emphasize, to bring everybody onto the table to discuss possible futures together and make them aware of what are the trade-offs and the different tensions that are there, and come up with governance structures that's part of innovation, at that level in the public service, to actually address how do you best address these political tensions or sort of not only political but also really tangible tensions and trade-offs materially wise. And so I think, there's certainly time or room to learn, experiment, as the mission is wanting to do, to learn and to do things better. But I think we have some strong hooks in the adaptation strategy, as well in the mission, that actually pick up on that concern or the actual point that this is a very political thing and that needs to be addressed at the appropriate levels. Thank you.
Okay,
I would only add to really just a couple of builds, and I'm going to apologize for a moment of domestic life entering into this. You can probably hear a distant trumpet. That's my son's trumpet lesson, who was not impressed when I suggested he might need to cancel it. So I think just two elements that I would add in. One is climate is political, adaptation is political. I completely agree. I think the question is, we have at stake our capacity to think about policy and the political construct and the political environment and the way in which we use it or are used or kind of acted on by it, in all of the ways in which we approach climate. And we know that one of the greatest kind of elements at risk in our current way of living in the face of climate change is democracy and democratic process and the entire mechanisms by which we take participatory decisions. I think that there are two things that really stand out here. One is we need representations, kind of people in aggregate, in cities, in sort of sense of national or regional identity, mobilize through representations, through narratives, through stories, through images. We desperately need those elements to be brought in, because I would agree a kind of a technocratic discourse on how to get adaptation and resilience to work and how we're going to solve for it. I don't think citizen engagement and participation is simply a consultation process. This is about mobilizing imagination, but it's really about mobilizing will. And that needs the kind of framework, and that's the second element I really wanted to bring in. The missions are about innovation. This is not a consultative process on a kind of a dialogue, multi-stakeholder dialogue process. It is and it isn't, but it's really about innovation. It's about turning ideas to action, about finding problems and finding solutions in the same moment. And it's about testing those fast and identifying as quickly and as speedily as possible through that process of learning by doing what works, what doesn't work, and where are the huge cultural obstacles to some of this big political change. And I think we have an opportunity to embrace what we're trying to do here as something that is inherently transformative and is asking for transformation rather than incrementalism. And that means we have to kind of put all ends of the spectrum together, but in the mud, as it were, literally in the mud, not sort of around a theoretical table, but on a very, very practical table. And I think that's what we've got an opportunity to do. It's certainly at risk of being politicized in every direction, which is why I'm kind of hoping that by bringing communities together closer and closer to the reality of climate change, we start to bust through some of those tendencies to take things into incremental and technical contexts and lose sight of the reality we're facing.
Okay. I'm looking now at the Q&A, and I think I need to bring one or two from there in to ask you. The first one I take to be a question about the relationship between mitigation and adaptation, and how we avoid potential risks of maladaptation. So, I mean, that's also a point that occurred to me when I was reading through this strategy, and also the recent mitigation policy. How is the Commission and the EU set up in terms of making sure, for example, that the Fit for 55 commitments are resilient to some of the climate impacts that are foreseen? And how do we make sure that some of the mitigation-related commitments that the EU made are not undermining an adaptation agenda in some way? I'm speaking from the UK, so the Committee on Climate Change is becoming much more vocal on that kind of a dynamic. So it might be interesting to reflect on that as well, from an EU perspective. Who would like to speak to that?
Well, I can start, and I'm sure everyone has a view. I think we have been discussing maladaptation already for years, and you know very well we have also problems with malmitigation. Just take the burning of biomass, or now fossil fuel-based hydrogen. I mean, but I think there has been an increased acknowledgement in the community, climate adaptation community, that this is an extremely serious matter and needs to be addressed. Now, for instance, in the international setting, we are very much looking through the lenses of what we call conflict sensitive or equity or gender sensitive adaptation, because indeed any intervention in a given context can indeed lead to winners and losers, and mostly, for instance, for water allocation, or you need to be extremely careful. When we were debating recently the economic stimuli under the recovery plan, we've been guided very much by what we call do no significant harm. So any sort of investment into either climate mitigation or climate adaptation had also to pass the test on the premise that it won't undermine typically biodiversity or circular economy or water resources, etc. Where I see a problem also, that we always say yes, nature-based solution is a no regret solution, but we are realizing that, say, for a standard by IUCN for the nature-based solutions, there's no definition of it, and so you can imagine that some smart heads would claim the sort of energy crops being a sort of nature-based solution, or the sort of monocultural forests that indeed have a sort of albedo effect, which is important in geoengineering, can be extremely damaging. So this is, I think, something that should be definitely curated. There's also a sort of understanding, okay, if something is good for mitigation, there is no need anymore to do the sort of resilience check. But let's take I don't know, electricity charging in the port. You have the first wave surge, and you have water everywhere. So it doesn't mean that something is per se good for mitigation. It doesn't need to be climate proof against the potential impacts. And it's really, these assets are much more costly, like the roofs, like the grids, that I think there indeed the need for, assessing the vulnerability and its placing in a certain location must be even more necessary. We are, from our perspective, always promoting the sort of double benefit, the mitigation adaptation interventions. Urban greening is one of the perfect examples where you can tick all the boxes. Forestry, but there you need to be definitely extremely careful, because the biodiverse-rich forests need also to be ready to deal with the climate dynamics. Yeah, it's what people look at as a possible, source for biomass or for renewables may not be the sort of perfect forest. So there are tensions. I think the most important is talking about them, investigating them in more depth, because these you just uncover more and more complex interrelationships, and giving some sort of same value to these aspects, because we know very well that climate adaptation in the past was really a sort of secondary concern, but I think in the next decade we will have to deploy a lot of solutions for climate adaptation to quickly deal with the impacts we already see.
I can see that Kirsten is typing, but maybe we've got about 4 more minutes until the end of. Oh, Kirsten isn't typing. It says on the Zoom that you were, but well, if anyone else would like to respond on the question of mitigation, adaptation, and avoiding maladaptation.
Yeah, just maybe very briefly from my side and from the perspective of the mission. I mean, really briefly, one of the key issues why we went in for a very systemic approach from the beginning on is exactly that we don't want the regional community to just pick out, for example, floods or forest fires and then just plow ahead of, or agriculture and say, oh, we need to adapt to more droughts, and so we just pump more water out of the ground to irrigate more. This is exactly the type that we wanted to avoid by sort of really enshrining this and giving a hand to the regions a systemic approach where they really look at all this from all different angles, involve all different stakeholders and vulnerable people that are affected on this, and then then it's about the testing and solution, looking actually what happens and still reflecting that with them, visualizing possible futures, going back to them, say, if that's what you guys had sorted out, in your discussions, going back to them, seeing, is that really what you want? You will create this and this and this kind of trade-offs, and so that's, I think, at the bottom of this idea of doing a systemic approach.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just one build on that, actually, that I think my understanding that one of the key conclusions of the mission board has been to really emphasize the notion of an adaptive capacity. And I think we really, really need to not lose sight of that, because when we're talking about climate adaptation, we are talking about the fact that the goalposts will keep moving, and that everything we do to mitigate, we're going to have to continually adapt to a world that we have not fully understood at all, let alone, and that's just the incremental change, let alone what's way beyond us. So in fact, the core of this is to build the capacity to constantly adapt and understand how do we balance the incredibly difficult choices we need to make to reduce emissions, but more importantly, to regenerate and to live and to work out what it means to live sustainably and regeneratively as the world changes physically and as our societies change. It's the reason why, for example, I think food systems are so critical to this mission, because they land home for people a very real sort of set of differences around what's available, what's possible. I think it's just, it's easy to say, but the relationship between transformation and the capacity, a constantly adaptive capacity for that, is probably what I've said is one of the single greatest contributions and challenges of the adaptation mission and the strategy that Eleanor is referring to.
Okay. I think we're at time now. We're at 1/2 the hour, and we've reached the end of this extremely stimulating and timely, as somebody emphasised, discussion. So I'll need to wrap up if I may now. I'd like to thank everyone for their engagement. I'm sorry we didn't get to more of the questions in the Q&A, but above all, thanks to the 4 panelists for sharing their valuable time and their insights with us. A lot of food for thought to take away. I was struck by the reference earlier to the quote about mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. That's, I believe, John Holdren in the White House a few years came away with that characterization of 3 possible choices when it comes to climate change. And I think we've heard today how EU policymakers and stakeholders of various kinds are attempting to boost the adaptation element of those choices, making it faster, smarter, more systemic, more capable of inspiring publics and coordinators as well as it can be with the first of the choices, which is mitigation, all in the interests of minimizing the third unfortunate dimension, which is suffering. And that we were all, I'm sure, keen to encourage the EU's efforts to develop its policy landscape in order to have the best possible combination, shall we say, between those 3 possibilities that present themselves. I will wrap up there, but join us again later in the week if you can. I just want to flag up that on the 30th of September, 1500 CET is the next roundtable. This one will be looking at the ongoing importance of the UK-EU relationship in the turbulent times that we are living through. So thanks again for joining this session, and thanks again to all the excellent panelists and to you for joining us, and goodbye.